Okay, welcome to our first community forum of our Urbanscape year. I'm Kat Quinn, I'm the Associate Dean, and I want to welcome everyone and let you know that this is now the first of 4 community forums, 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. The Urbanscape year is a product of a number of people working together and bringing together a number of elements of the activities on the Providence campus. We have student affairs working on fun things like they did a tour of the steel yard last week. We have our academic component working on an urban studies program which we've introduced this year. We have the arts and culture, urban arts and culture exhibits, which you've seen out in the hallway. Those change every month, so you'll have to come back in a couple of weeks for the new one. And in addition, there are flyers out there for the triple-decker show is the next particular, it's a multimedia presentation that Mark Levitt, who will be, Mark Levitt, who is going to coordinate tonight, has put together. And then we have other events such as a community conversation, which will take place Wednesday night. We're very excited about that in particular. That was kind of put together at the last minute, but we have 3 community leaders who have done very innovative things, including Bert Krenke from AS220, and they will be talking to, in a very informal way, up in that first tier of the Student Center at 7 o'clock as well. 11 o'clock, yeah. What time is it? But the general idea behind this emerged from the fact that we're sitting here in downtown Providence, and a lot of people don't know that URI has a presence in Providence. And at the same time, a number of our students have been going the traditional academic trajectory and not getting engaged in the community in ways that we would like. So we see this as a way of blending campus and community and really trying to learn from each other. So we're very, very excited about this year that we're able to produce these events and enjoy your company. Tonight's forum is co-sponsored by the Harrington School of Communication and Media, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Renee Hobbs, who is the director of that program, to do a welcome and tell us a little more.
I'm the new founding director of the Harrington School of Communication and Media. I am just delighted to be a co-sponsor for this terrific event. You may or may not know that 3 years ago, the former CEO of Thomson Reuters, a University of Rhode Island alum named Dick Harrington, made a generous gift to the University of Rhode Island to create the Harrington School of Communication and Media. It brings together 6 programs that had previously not been in a relationship. Those are the departments of journalism, film media, public relations, communication studies, the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies, and the Department of Writing and Rhetoric. We serve every student at the University of Rhode Island who take courses in public speaking and speech communication and in writing, English composition. We have 1,350 undergrads, 350 grads, and 70 full-time faculty. What's been absolutely exciting is to see how much this faculty and the students and the community want to find ways to work together across disciplinary boundaries and across urban, rural, and bay. When I came here, I discovered the 3 campuses. I've been giving them my signature names. Down in Kingston, we say it's leafy green. Out at the Bay campus, we say that's ocean blue. And up here in Providence, I've been calling it Urban Edge. And it's my dream to bring those 3 campuses closer together through the Harrington School of Communication and Media, especially by offering some signature programs. We already have the Communication Studies and the Film Media program here, but we're eager to build programs that provide more opportunities for cross-fertilization between the campuses. And one idea that Kat and I are hatching, very timely for this special program, is called urban immersion. that would bring students here for a whole semester to take interdisciplinary courses that would put them in community outreach opportunities, allow them to make connections between theory and practice. And for that reason, I'm so delighted to be able to speak to you tonight and to get you ready for the speaker. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Kat. I appreciate it. Thank you again. Thank you.
And we've just been thrilled to have Renee on the Kingston campus and our campus, because it's not always the case that someone makes that effort to find all the campuses of the university, and we've just been delighted. I'm going to introduce again Mark Levitt, again because he was here last month with our keynote speaker. Mark has been an amazing resource for us. He has boundless connections around the globe, and he also has the ability to put together unique and very special combinations of people to come together to talk about important issues. Mark is an author, he's a storyteller, he is a playwright, he is a lot of things, an educator, but what matters to us is that he has this wonderful program called Action Speaks that is aired on PBS, public radio, I should say. It's syndicated, and you can pick it up if you look on GBH or any of the other websites. But that led one of our staff members, Paul Florin, to Mark, and Paul Florin comes back and says, "You got to involve this guy." And it's been a great experience for us, and we really appreciate all you've done. So Mark's going to tell you what he's got in store for you tonight.
All right, my first question for you candidates is, how do you feel about the Libyan issue today? Sorry, I've always wanted to moderate a presidential debate. So, first of all, Renee, I know from personal experience the effect she's had on one of my good friends' life. And if she has any percentage of that effect on the University of Rhode Island in general, we're going to be in for a real treat. And I welcome you here, and I've always wanted to meet you ever since I've learned about your relationship to my good friend and our good friend. Kat, Paul, Steve, Marshall, Tammy, Ann. Where's Ann? Ann is hiding. These are all people without whom this entire series couldn't have happened. These are people that have endured the heat of summer. These are people that have endured the coldness of winter. These are people that have braved the springtime and have come inside when they rather be outside. And these people are people who have braved my sense of humor. And instead have stayed well and been involved in creating this wonderful series. And I think in a lot of ways in carving out a new niche or a stronger niche for the University of Rhode Island in its embrace of urbanism and its attempt to identify itself with probably one of the most critical issues, problems, possibilities that our society has. The bundling together of lots of people, especially in this time of globalization and during the Great Recession, and trying to just simply figure out what to do. And in our particular case, having a large piece of property like 195's removal to work with. So I really applaud all those people who have been involved, who've made a commitment, and who have had the intelligence to choose me to work on these forums. I do thank you. So here's what we're going to do. We obviously are not inundated with lots of people, but the people that are here are good people, bright people, intelligent people, people willing to commit to this conversation. Am I right? So what we're going to do is make a pledge right here. Our pledge is that we are now co-creators of this program. and that without you, the program's going to be bereft in some form or another. So I need promises that you're going to be asking questions along with me, that you're not going to leave here saying, I wish Mark would have asked about this, I wish such and such said this, and what this person says was just full of it. So you're going to intercede when necessary, ask when curious, and comment when compelled to do so. Because we're here. It's a small group. We're hanging out. We're just talking about urbanism, how people set in. So why don't we just relax, dedicate this amount of time for a mutual exploration of these issues, along with the wonderful panelists we have, and I'm going to introduce them now. David Faflik is an assistant professor of English at URI. He is the author of Boarding Out, Inhabiting the American Urban Literary Imagination, 1840-1860. A student of the antebellum city in literature, he thinks that many American authors before the U.S. Civil War shared his concerns with a fleeting sense of time and narrowing realizations of space, and have characterized metropolitan modernity in the West. His teaching and research to date have attempted to demonstrate that the era's authors wrote similar concerns into their work. David Faflik, come on up. Miguel Robles-Druan is an assistant professor of urbanism and director, MS Design and Urban Ecologies, and the director of Urban Ecologies graduate program at the New School Parsons in New York. He recently co-edited, authored the book Urban Asymmetries, Studies and Projects on Neoliberal Urbanization that reviews the dire consequences that neoliberal urban policies have had upon the city and discusses the possible alternatives to market-driven development. Robles-Druan's areas of specialization are design, research, interventions, and strategies in uneven urbanization, and areas of social urban conflict, urban political economy, and urban theory. Miguel. And finally, Ravi Perry, assistant professor of political science and the Stenson Scholar for Municipal Governance at Mississippi State University, an expert on African American politics, ethnic studies, and public policy. His commentary, op-eds, editorials, and award-winning oratory have been featured in various national media outlets. His activism, commentary, and oratory has been featured in national media outlets such as CNN, The Huffington Post, Politics Daily, Ebony.com, TheGrio.com, TheRoot.com, and, of course, National Public Radio. Ravi Perry, come on up. We welcome you to Urbanscape, and thanks for taking some time. I think you'll be heard if you just talk loudly enough in there. And if anybody wants to come up and ask a question, please do so at any time. Yeah, I'll bring it down to you. I'll bring it down to you, okay? So, what's happening in urbanism today? Miguel?
That's a great start. Many things are shifting. I think it's a very exciting, exciting and depressing. So I guess depression always leads to some form of excitement, but it's a very exciting and depressing time where, since 2008, basically the world realized that urbanization was, not the world, but finance realized that urbanization was one of its most important instruments for dispersal, for investment, and a lot of massive changes have occurred sort of in the dynamics of urbanization around the world. Nevertheless, the most sort of intense forms of investment still continue to be the city. And one of the things that needs to be addressed in this panel is that, as several authors from Henri Lefebvre to David Harvey mentioned before, urbanization is one of the primary, if not sort of the most perfect mirror of capitalism as an entity. It serves as the placeholder of things. David Harvey also said once that when you have a lot of money, it becomes a problem. And that problem normally gets resolved into the eyes of the people that have a lot of money through urbanization, through reinvestment and those sort of things. So since, let's say, 2007 or 2006, when there has been a downturn on this globally, not only in the US, but absolutely everywhere, there's been a lot of reconfiguration, not so much from the banking systems or from the sort of the wealthy investors that occupy cities right now, but a lot from people that are fed up. And I think this is what is a bit more promising in that regard. I haven't seen changes. You could talk about Spain. We know that there's around 2.5–3 million vacant properties, and those are the ones that are being counted. And it still continues to give out land for private development as we speak, under the current crisis. So the changes there are not really so apparent, but the changes of different community neighborhoods, civic organizations, for example, in Barcelona or in Madrid, which are completely fed up, they're bringing very, very interesting sort of counter-arguments and propositions and actions in urbanization. So I think the exciting part of it is that we see different forms flourishing. Hopefully this will be something that stays.
So you're saying, let me just get it clear. You're saying what you're noticing is an increased privatization of public space. At the same time, you're seeing other forces operating and organizing alternatives to the privatization, or as some would call it, the neoliberal model.
Yeah, I mean, to see it very optimistically, I always like to think, and this is what I'm trying always to write and think on, and when I get to talk to people in government, I always say that there is some type of a parallel form of urbanization going on. And more is becoming organized, which before it wasn't. And the reason it's becoming organized is because of this tremendous economic oppression, which most of the people are in. So one would say that, yes, we're more and more in this form of kind of Orwellian apparatus. I don't know if you ever read these cyberpunk novels. I find them very fascinating in the way that they take the picture of a very powerful sort of all-dominant system, but within that all-dominant system there are these sort of instances inside.
So you're seeing, again, and we'll get back to this, you're seeing basically, as I think it was a situation as, or the French in 68, you see the beach underneath the cement.
Yes.
Essentially, yeah. And Ravi, how does the rubber, though, hit the road? What is happening in urban America right now? I mean, it's a big question, but just to get us started, what do you see as a scholar of urban America? What do you notice?
Well, that's a boatload of a question. But
that's my job. Thank you.
But essentially, the main thing that I've been studying and is reality is the fact that most urban communities have undergoing significant demographic change. Then they are completely different cities today in the 21st century than cities were 30, 40 years ago. Just to highlight a few examples. The city we're in right now, Providence, has in the last decade has had a 10% increase in their non-white population, nearly 10%, I think roughly 8 or 9 in Latina population as well. That has resulted in the election of the first Latino mayor of a capital city in the country. And that is just one example of such change. Newark, New Jersey, if you're familiar with that city, is another example. 50 years ago was 80% white. It's now 80% black and Latino. In terms of the Newark metropolitan statistic area. Ironically, on the flip side, the change is not necessarily just a loss in white population as well. Take Newark as another example. Newark once had, 1970, roughly about 70% black population. It's now down to about 52. And so you have shifts in minority population, which usually means a loss in black population in a lot of cities nationwide, with a growth in Asian and Latino populations, while whites are also growing because while they, in most cases, left in the 60s and 70s, what most people have called white flight, they are now returning to the cities, and they're returning to re-gentrified areas, and gentrification typically has meant in the United States that black and brown people are displaced, white people who have the economic means to move in do, and the neighborhood changes as a result. And it changes aesthetically for the better. I think just about everyone would agree, but it definitely has an impact on the cohesion of communities of color that once existed in those locales that no longer do. And so the main thing that's happening in urban America is significant demographic change. Those are a few examples, but I can list you dozens of others, from Sacramento to LA to Oakland, all Californian cities, to all the major cities in Texas as well, to Chicago, to Detroit, even that was once 90% black. It's now roughly 80%. It's even a decline there. And so you are finding that the populations are changing, and as a result, the populations are changing, the politics are changing as well.
But so sort of these two are very connected, because as you were talking about the urban America becoming a vehicle for investment, essentially what it is beginning to attract is more and more, quote, and I put these categories always in quote, as any kind of racial categories I put in quote, but white people coming in, primarily upper middle class, upper class, and their use of the city might be somewhat different as well. They're expecting different kind of commercial opportunities.
Yes.
That itself affects the way people actually live in the city and how they operate within the city. And there's certain expectations for certain kinds of safety, quote, concerns within the urban America that changes the way in which both the expectation and the reality of urban life is created. Am I correct with that?
Absolutely. And Washington, D.C. is a perfect example. The recent historic Democratic primary loss of Adrian Fenty was solely, essentially, because of what you just said, Mark, was that there was a huge rift between the white, regentrified, new communities in D.C. and the kind of old guard black communities that were displaced, and essentially the rift is around exactly the nexus that you're talking about, and that is the whites having moved back in with different orientation to goals and interest, and blacks feeling as though that they have lost that battle, that kind of idyllic or idealistic battle. And as a result, what you have seen is the changing of the guard in Washington, D.C.
David, what does this mean in terms of how people experience the everyday, where the rubber hits the road, in terms of how people actually live in a city? As the cities begin to change, do you see it similar to the 19th century, or is something different coming up?
Well, my typical response will be, of course, it depends. And it depends largely on perhaps on which city you happen to occupy and which part of which city you happen to occupy.
No pun intended, right?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
For example, we've been talking a little bit about sort of the cities of the U.S. Rust Belt, or what was once the U.S. Rust Belt. I mean, what's happening in urban Detroit today might feel very different from what's happening in gentrifying Manhattan, for example. There's symbolic sort of creation of arts and entertainment areas which sort of lend prestige to urban areas. But on the flip side, as Rob and I were discussing beforehand, urban and city carries a negative connotation in many places and for many people. And if you expand the map and think about cities of the Americas, we would also have to include Latin America in this conversation and look at drug crime in places like Mexico and sort of the pushing to the margins of urban peoples, poor urban peoples in particular, in much of South America. So in a sense, it's moving in two directions, and many directions simultaneously, I would have to say.
I'm interested in what you said about creating these urban entertainment centers.
Well, for example, in downtown Providence, or even in places like downtown Cleveland, for example, which I visited this summer, there's a lot of emphasis among civic officials in sort of touting their cities as sort of entering into a new era. But as Robbie's point, again, is well taken, a new era, but at whose expense? I mean, where were the people who once inhabited those spaces, which are now being filled by, again, sort of tourist destination spots, in a sense?
I want to observe two things. I'm a big believer that capitalism doesn't see race. Doesn't see race. Money is money for and investment is investment, and wherever whatever color is there, it doesn't really matter. A big example of this would be Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York, where most of the sort of gentrification is actually being done by black population. So people that, and we have many examples of these. So it's not my intention, or I don't think it will be my intention, this thing to sort of racialize the topic, but I think it should be discussed mostly in terms of class, which is what you were referring to. There's white poor people, and there's black poor people, and brown poor people, and these are the people that are sort of completely being displaced from point to another and to another. Now, one thing that we have to realize is that even though the amount of millionaires has been growing, right? The amount of poverty that's been growing is far, surpasses, the amount of millionaires that are there. Yesterday I was reading a statistic that there are around 1,100 and almost 1,200 billionaires in the world, right? And not long ago there were 50, right? Yes,
things
there
are better.
But there are around, according to UN statistics, around 1 billion people, close to 1 billion people, sort of not eating, literally not eating. So when you balance basically what all these cities are trying to do, attract investment, attract the wealthy, rich class, which apparently has been the strategy of every single city I known since neoliberal sort of turnover came. It's attracting the hip, the crowd. We're talking about creative city. We're talking about all these sort of things. But it's not only that. There's also a limit of the amount of white or brown or black sort of hip population. There is, and that population, I was saying, will normally choose a city like New York or Paris or perhaps Boston or San Francisco or such and such. And that's a floating part of the population, but it's the minimum. And I think the biggest discussion here has to be what happens with the 55% of children that live below the poverty line in Providence, right? What happens to close to 40% of families that are below the poverty line over here? Now, instead of changing or moving the discussion towards sort of those that can afford living in nice, lofts and drink cappuccinos every day, well, which is normally what takes over the discussion. Now, in these type of panels, we tend to focus on sort of the stadiums, the big investments, and these sort of things. And normally, by the end of the panel, we totally forget about what about that 40% of the city, or it's even larger, side of the city, of those of us that literally struggle every single month to come by. And that includes me as an academic, right? And I guess all of you here. No, but it's very important. See, this is what happens with spectacularization. Mm-hmm. Spectacle is such an incredible device for capital, right?
Could you define what you mean by spectacle?
Well, I guess you mentioned Guy Debord with the Situationists, no? That spectacle becomes sort of the means for which we forget about, the dire sort of consequences of reality. It masks it.
Do you know who won the football game, by the way?
Or the presidential debate? That's another spectacle. And so let's say we focus on Atlantic Yards, right? But it's about this Atlantic Yards meaning these sort of the Brooklyn, so new stadium nets, whatever. But what happens through the other side? So we can talk about Atlantic Yards, or we can talk about in the case of New Jersey and Newark, we had the PAC, or the new stadium that was being developed. But we hardly ever discuss about these other sides. No? And I know there are 3 or 4 zones here towards the west that are quite poor. And this is where I would like to shift.
Question from the audience.
It seems to me that so far you're talking about trends that are happening that no one is consciously trying to influence. Demographics, so of course people are trying to consciously bring people into the city and so on and so forth. What I'm interested in is whether or not you can get to a discussion of policies that cities can do to try to influence in a productive way for the neighborhoods some of that dynamic. One example would be the Boston Compact, where downtown development is connected to investment in neighborhoods, things like that. Could you address that a little bit, and what cities are or are not doing with those kinds of policies?
I'll take your question, and I'll also use the chance to be ridiculous and plug my new book coming out. And there's flyers on the table in the back. But in that book, I study mayors. This is primarily what I study. I primarily study African-American mayors. The book, though, includes, it's an edited volume. It includes some major scholars of urban politics from throughout the country, and examining Black, Latino, and Asian mayors that were elected in major cities throughout the country in the last decade or so. And the question is essentially, what have they done for people who look like them in these cities that are historically or still yet majority white? And so it's not so much what the cities have done to create these policies is what these individual mayors have sought to do. And some of the specifics vary city by city, of course, and unless you're all from these various cities, it really would have of little significance to you what the various details are. But there's one theory that connects all these cases, and it's the theory that I borrowed from John Powell, who's now at Berkeley, and he's a legal scholar. And the theory is called targeted universalism, and it's the idea that as a person of color, black, Latino, Asian, or some other non-white person, and you are in the position of power in the mayor's office, that you can actually actively pursue policies and programs that are designed to improve the quality of life of people who look like you. So in other words, if you're a black mayor in a majority white city, for African Americans, you're an Asian mayor in a majority white or historically white city, then for Asian Americans. And recently we have two famous examples in San Francisco and in Oakland. The idea is that because you can frame the policies in a way that convince whites that these policies are not going to be enacted at their expense, albeit though with their help, and that the entire city grows as a result. So it's not universalism, which is the idea that we're all in this kind of boat together, and it ignores the significance of race. It's called targeted universalism. It's because what these mayors have done, and thereby the cities that they control, they have sought to emphasize that race does matter, and it obviously crosses with class as well. But the idea that, hey, I understand as the mayor that this issue of a low educational obtainment seems to affect mostly people of color in my urban city. How can I then convince whites that we need to invest funds, in some cases taxpayer supported funds, in order to make this program a reality? That yes, it's going to primarily benefit black and brown kids in, say, Providence, but it's also going to have a large impact on the entire city as well. And here's why. And the mayors would say something like, well, because a larger educational obtainment for everyone in the city thereby improves the entire city's ability to do X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C. And so what we have found is that, A, it's possible to create policies and programs that have a targeted benefit for people of color and for low-income populations without alienating whites or higher-income populations, which is somewhat of a new finding.
Wait. Give us one.
Give us one. Okay. In my hometown of Toledo, Ohio,
Yep.
The mayor that I used to work for and now I'm studying, Jack Ford, was elected in 2002, served one term. The reason why he served one term is essentially because he was a little bit too much of a targeted universalistic mayor, and you can, of course, read more about why that was the case. But essentially, he created two programs. One was the capacity building program in Toledo that he worked with the Association of General Contractors, which is the major company in the state of Ohio and has chapters in all the major cities in Ohio that are who the cities go to essentially subcontract out all city contracts. You know, any given city is giving out millions of dollars of contracts to individuals a year. Most of those contracts in cities are going to white men. And the reason for that is not necessarily because the mayors are trying to be preferentially beneficial to white men, but just historically the construction trades, the electrician trades, etc., have been trades that have been historically overcome by those people. So what he did was he created a capacity building program, which was a joint effort with the university, a major university in the town, that made sure that blacks, Latinos, and women as well were given the opportunity to apply for city contracts, and he insisted that any city contract have a certain percentage of minority and or women business participation. And he literally, to back this up, he changed the city regulations at the time when he was mayor so that the Department of Affirmative Action and Contract Compliance also was merged with the Department of Purchasing, which in city local politics is a little bit perhaps boring information, but purchasing or some division thereof is who really decides who get what contract in cities. It's not the mayor, it's no one else. It's really the head of the purchasing division. And so because of that merger, the contracts then had to be approved by the affirmative action director, not just the purchasing director, and that resulted in essentially several made millionaires. Most of them were men and women of color.
So he put another layer in between the actual another layer of coordination between the money and who was going to get the money, and that had to run through the affirmative action division.
Yes.
Right. In terms of how people enjoy or participate in the city, do you notice a difference in the 19th century than the present time? You know, obviously we're talking huge swaths of issues, but I know the 19th century, for instance, in Central Park in New York, even in Providence, Rhode Island, there was fights. People felt like that the urban world was potentially contestable. When they, in fact, in Providence, Rhode Island, when they filled in the what was essentially a lake, which we have the remnants of now, which is where the water fire is, there was a big protest. There was huge protest about whether to fill it in or not. There was a moment where parts of the city are contestable. People have different ideas about how to use it, and they fight about it. Does that make for something that cities enjoy, like, need as part of it? That people feel like they can take control of their lives? And did you see that in the 19th century? Or do people just want to kind of get their bread and go home to eat it?
Well, I mean, what I'm seeing really in the 19th century is sort of very much a transitional period, I would have to say. It's, for many people, 1840s, 1850s in particular, before the Civil War, I mean the city is as much a problem to be solved as it is a commodity to be enjoyed. I would have to say there's really an adaptation period in which people are learning to think of the city in non-threatening ways in terms of pleasure and enjoyment. The diversity, all the things that we associate now with the positive sides of cities, were at the time was seen as more threatening for many people, I would have to say. And so this, as an infrastructure develops of actual restaurants, for example, of apartment buildings, which is really a post-Civil War phenomenon, of an entertainment industry, as all of these things sort of institutionalize and take hold, people are more and more willing, as the 19th century progresses, I think, to see the city as a source of enjoyment, as you're suggesting, and sort of, but.
And was this generally enjoyed among all classes? And was there many different opportunities for entertainment?
That's as before. Class is always sort of the key qualifier here. Cross-class enjoyment is difficult to sustain as the century progresses with what people would call, a scholar like Lawrence Levine, for example, sort of the hierarchicalization of culture during this period. For example, the theater would be the prime example, I would have to say, in which mixed audiences at one time would appear in 19th century theaters, but by the time you have things like vaudeville by the end of the century, I mean, there's different sort of class segregation occurring.
But you had availability, you had entertainment, you had culture available to all classes. Whether or not they participated together is another issue. For instance, in the parks, Coney Island or something like that, or we had our own in Rhode Island, was accessible through public transportation. And a lot of these kind of things needed basically a streetcar ticket and some money to get in, essentially.
Okay, but I mean, a model like Central Park, which does seem like a model of a democratic sort of pleasure space, I guess we could call it, is very much also rooted in an idea of control by the people who are designing it and implementing it.
Tell us more about that.
Bringing classes together, but also keeping classes in their respective places.
How did they do that? And I know the use of the park was quite contested, even as it was being organized and built. Am I correct?
Yes, but codes of behavior, really, for how one is supposed to present oneself and acquit oneself and perform, in a sense, within these.
Tell us more about that. I like that idea. Yeah.
The very idea of a sort of a Sunday in the park only works from the perspective of the park planners. As long as everyone sort of maintains what were considered at the time genteel codes of behavior of of middle-class civility and courtesy.
Which
in
meant
a
what?
sense.
And David, in real, actual concrete, you couldn't spit on the floor.
That's exactly where I was going, but that sort of behavior, exactly. Or even the idea of museums, having them open on Sundays when people who worked for a living could actually attend a museum. But once you're inside the museum, you don't spit on the floor. You don't bring food. If you're going to be, children should be seen and not heard. All these kinds of control mechanisms, in a sense, which, again, make sort of entertainments democratically accessible, but also only on certain terms, on the terms of the people who are sort of prescribing what these entertainments and sort of resources will be.
Because the City Beautiful movement, which was part of this process, had that as an underpinning, a certain way of performing, a certain way of behaving, along with the beautification. Am I right or wrong with that?
Yes, I mean, but it's more than just an aesthetic quality. I mean, it's about aesthetics and sort of a social. A certain kind of society becomes a city beautiful.
So it becomes a disciplinary. These parks, they becomes a disciplinary mechanism for the population.
That's the Foucauldian term we're taking at this point, but. To some extent, yes, I would have to say.
Well, discipline only in the fact that, everybody is sort of hanging out there. And then they have to be taught, quote, from some points about how to behave, how to walk, how to talk, how to participate in this, quote, civil society that's defined by the upper middle class Protestant elite in these cities. Am I right?
Yes.
So in that way, that's a very interesting way in which the city becomes in Rhode Island, in southern Rhode Island, down in Peacedale where I live, the neighborhood guild was a way in which the new working class who was moving in, the Irish and Italian, moving in to work in the big factories, it was a way of teaching them language, teaching them behavior, teaching them all of these ways in which one would become, quote, assimilated or good workers within the structure of American industrial life. Is that?
Yes. So you have to wonder. I mean, is there a net gain involved here? And the gain would be, again, a question of for whom.
And for whom and whose city? Question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really fascinating point. So I'm guessing a question for all the panelists and especially for the moderator. So I just recently moved here from Philadelphia, and one of the things that my husband's a chess player. And one of the things he observed about Philadelphia was that the chess playing community was one urban place that had where there were a huge variety of people from all different walks of life came together, right? He'd be playing with the homeless guy, and then he'd be playing with the surgeon. And that basically it was, we think, a unique space, that it was a public place and it was a public experience, but it was really inclusive. And since we've moved here, we're wondering, where is that place? And why aren't there more places like that?
Well, the question of public space is a great one. What do we have? I mean, for instance, in Mexico you have Zócalos, and in other parts of the world, you're referring basically to Washington Square Park in New York, when the chess players all gather, these weird collection of people, some of whom hadn't bathed, some of whom were scholars, it didn't matter, but the game was important. Is this possible? Does this happen in urban environments anymore? This kind of democratizing of public space? Or is public space becoming privatized or more like Central Park in the early days, where certain behaviors are expected, certain people are allowed in, and others are excluded by virtue of simply how you behave, what you smell like, how loudly you talk?
And public space is one of those concepts that you can find so many definitions about and we'll never agree on. And for some reason, it still becomes sort of one of the core issues, especially when you're discussing urbanism or urban design or these agendas. People are just so passionate about public space and what exactly that means. My definition of public space is the space where citizens can actually claim democracy.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they can actually take the streets and claim and push things that are somehow being inserted against them. Spaces of protest, spaces of dissent, spaces of contestation, of rupture. That for me is a true, real sort of space. And in my opinion, those spaces don't exist anymore. Very few spaces. I mean, of course, we can go to Egypt. We can go, to perhaps Plaza del Sol in Madrid. We can, certain moments of eruptions or etc. But I was a week ago in Istanbul, and then there's this very important civic space called Taksim Square. And right now it's being totally redesigned.
Oh, don't tell me that.
Yeah, and with the idea of precisely, what Napoleon and Osman did in Paris. I mean, just basically make the spaces not so comfortable for those things to happen. We were just talking about Tompkins Square. Tompkins Square. We were talking about we can go in Union Square over there. The more and more sort of urban designers are playing the role of appeasers. Of space of appeasement. This is what they do. I mean, the majority of park designers, landscape architects, they're just thinking of this sort of very cute idea of public space where everybody loves each other and doing these benches. But the reality is what we need to construct is possibilities for not loving each other, but actually of contesting, because we're in a very dire moment.
But and the kind of behaviors that are expected.
Yes,
in these spaces,
and in that case, it's hard. I mean, I don't believe in that you can construct a space and suddenly people will start playing chess, right? I mean, this has to do so much with the culture of a place. It has so much to do with the potentials, the capacity of people to gather and feel common to each other. This happens in New York. I've seen it happening in some space in Paris, but the last time I was in Paris, it was not there anymore.
The question is, does it? So it lives within a context, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It lives within and in Providence, as you were worrying about, this kind of liminal spaces, these kind of spaces that are sort of in between and owned by a lot of different people, are not really present, are they, as much, or are they?
I would say in U.S. cities, this type of space does exist, but you have to, and I'm not a history professor, so I'm going to screw this up, but essentially, we have more public lands available, to my knowledge, the further west you go in this country, in part because the decrease in private ownership of public land. So right now I live in Worcester, Massachusetts, where the notion of a park is completely different from where I grew up in Ohio, where a park for me is, first of all, in most cases, at least several acres. And it has trails and lakes and ponds, but I had to learn, moving to New England several years ago. Well, that's a function of literally the space that was available when Ohio was founded and made in the state in the early 1800s that made that space available. The other thing that makes places like Washington Park and ironically, Washington Square, and ironically, Washington Square also in Chicago, similarly, I would use a tennis analogy. My husband is actually a tennis player, and when we moved here, finding tennis players of various backgrounds is extremely difficult. Now, you could argue this elite nature of the sport, et cetera, and yes, that's a part of it, but it's also the function that in Chicago, where my husband is from, you could walk outside your apartment complex in Hyde Park, for example, and you would have all types of people available from all types of backgrounds who are willing, able, interested to play. And you don't have that, and partly that is because of the lack of space in certain communities like Providence and other New England communities. But the other part of it is the neighborhoods that are around what you call public space. And those neighborhoods are, in fact, as I've indicated, they are changing. And a discussion we were having earlier is how do you really define what a neighborhood, in fact, is anymore, given so many changes that are going on in the urban landscape. And in general, the reason why I would argue you don't see the availability of chess players from all backgrounds is in part not because they don't exist, but it is because the orientation to the city structure here in Providence does not allow that to happen. There's not a close proximity of people living in a small confined area with a park surrounding it. You will not find that in Providence. It does not exist.
David?
Well, I'm thinking of Jane Jacobs here and sort of the mixed use neighborhood model of not just of people doing things, but of people just being people. And there needs to be, I guess, on some level, the right balance struck between those two things in order to have a truly genuine public space in which not everyone's doing, meaning not everyone's engaged in some kind of business or commerce, that there are also people not working very specifically.
So it's yeah, that seems interesting. So it's the spaces that are not necessarily defined by commerce or by business.
Right, but you need residential,
right.
But you also need leisure spaces.
And in Providence, we also have a
those.
real isolation of the outlying neighborhoods. There's Providence, the downtown Providence itself doesn't have that multiplicity of uses at this point, not yet.
Although there is the ice skating rink, which
there is the ice skating
arguably
rink. Good point.
every winter season is a
point.
place where you can
It's
find
quite
people
diverse.
from all types of backgrounds
That's a good
gathering
point.
together.
That's a good point. Yeah, Maureen, sorry.
Yeah, I would agree about the ice rink, and also, although it's not the kind of space you were talking about, Miguel, water fire attracts a huge cross-section of people. But I'm very struck by one problem we have, and it's also true in Philadelphia, and that is the stratification by class of residential areas, which I think really works against, of course, any kind of interaction. I mean, neighborhoods that are certainly racially integrated are not class integrated, or at least not block by block. And I always used to go online and play with the University of Michigan thing about housing. It's drawn from census data, how integrated is your neighborhood. You can look block by block, and that's where tipping points happen. Whoops, 4 black people on that block, all the white people are moving. It's really fascinating. But they don't do it by economic data, and I think that's right now incredibly powerful. And of course, very closely linked to racial stratification as well. The poorer neighborhoods are predominantly in Providence, so-called minority neighborhoods. I don't know if anyone would comment.
Before coming to the U.S., I was living in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands has had a big history. I mean, among many sort of Northern European countries, of this thing they call integration. Where you come from somewhere else, and somehow suddenly you are taught literally. You have to take classes on how to integrate with the current thing. I mean, one of the biggest schemes on housing and residential things that were explored during sort of, I would say, late 80s, early 90s, and all the way till now, is this issue of mixed dwelling. And mixed actually meant precisely, inviting the Moroccans and the Turkish, mostly Muslim population, which has been, as you all know, quite a big issue in Europe, to live together with, a regular white. In this case, it matters because there was before that only white. Well, no, it's not true, but the majority were white. And mostly white Dutch people. Even those coming from the Antillian islands and the colonies were considered to be other, even though they're they hold a Dutch passport in some form, right, or whatever. And all these experiments were precisely given the tone of race, I think one of the biggest myths not myths, but one of the biggest sort of masks that cultural studies and that comes, in my opinion, with neoliberal culture, also neoliberal economics, has created this mask of race to underscore the mask of class, right? Class is not something we talk anymore because it's too controversial. If I mention class here, I'm already a socialist. I can tell you this, right? Of course, yes, that's of course. The issue of class in these cases became, the biggest problem, right? You had a Turkish and Moroccan that was given a property there that was not earning not even close, to what they were earning. I mean, Canada has also tried to do this a lot. I mean, they invite all these sort of Mexicans and Costa Ricans and Guatemalans to go and work in their fields. They also try to mix them in their neighborhoods, but it just simply does not cut it. And then you have all these sort of stratification that end up being, because looking at the mask.
Wait. What do you mean it doesn't cut it? Why doesn't it work to basically put multiple economic classes within the same?
Because
kind of
the
buildings?
structure is already given as a separate entity. I mean, it's not. I mean, you're not talking about integrating sort of economic systems or given the possibility of establishing new productive systems within different class structures, but already the fabrication, the instruction manual, the formula allows already for that division. I mean, it's already divided. No, I mean, even as a start.
Well, the division is obviously they're all working within a capitalist system. They're all working in a system of hierarchy. They're all working within a system of jobs, economy. What can you do? There's an alternative here, and we'll talk about that. But
this is exactly where I guess all my work has headed through.
Right. That's what we got to talk about. Yeah.
That there's a division between. A conception that, yes, I mean, in your same building, there's a person paying 60% less rent than you are, which is great in principle, right? But always that person is going to be the helper in the restaurant, or it's going to be the person, no matter what, the situation, I mean, the economic situation of that person is still there. Now, for the eyes of much Dutch people, they're benevolent. They are basically providing, a housing structure, which is much better than any American housing structure in terms of the provision of quality housing. But the class structure continues to be the same, or even polarized.
Right. No, I understand. I see what you're saying. That of course it's not taking the undercurrent. But say when I grew up in Queens, in a primarily Jewish neighborhood, but in 6-floor red brick apartment buildings, and there was a policy, as you asked, what can the government do? There was rent control.
Yes.
And what rent control enabled us to do was to live. My family, my father, mother were lawyers. There was a taxi cab driver down on the first floor. There was a guy who owned the local candy store up at the corner. There was a mixture of people there that we had the opportunity of getting to know. And obviously there were other ways in which I had other forms of diversity through summer camp, et cetera, et cetera. But it seemed like that at the very least is something that the government could do to allow for some sort of diverse experience that people would have.
Well, and there's a way to connect the last two questions as well, and that the result of that stratification does come into play, and when you look at the amenities available in neighborhoods. There's a reason why tennis courts are available in certain parts of town, whereas basketball courts are available in the other. And at least in the U.S. context, you cannot separate race from class. It reminds me of W.B. Du Bois when he talked about in Black Reconstruction the wages of whiteness, basically theorizing about why has there never been a poor people's movement in this country, and why there essentially never will be. And the reason that he came up with in the mid-20th century was essentially because whites, based on the data that he gathered from the I believe the 40s and the 50s, essentially they give such prioritization to their race that they will not allow them, even if they are low income, to coalesce with blacks to create a coalition or other groups that will be in their interest. And we actually see this in 21st century American politics today, where you see Appalachian whites still historically, for example, voting for the Republican Party, despite the fact that their policies do not usually represent their interest.
Marshall.
Yeah, as I'm listening to all this, I'm thinking, this is a very postmodern kind of situation you described. It's very fragmented. On the one hand, you have the greatest inequality in about 100 years. We've seen globally even more so. Mike Davis writes about planets of slums, right? So we have, on the one hand, incredible growth of urban poverty, especially in what used to be called the third world, but even here, I mean, somewhere that 40% that they're talking about at the presidential debates is living somewhere, the 40% who's in poverty now. On the other hand, we have a sort of a celebration of cities in a way. There's this whole sort of movement to theme parkize cities. Waterflyer here is an example of a theme park type of thing. And I'm wondering, first of all, this seems like a very contradictory situation. And is it being maintained through residential segregation? Is that the main mechanism? And secondly, what is the authenticity of things? I was in Brooklyn about 3 weeks ago at was supposedly the biggest street party in New York City, in Brooklyn Heights. And, it was incredibly mixed racially and ethnically. I would have thought probably class as well when I looked at the people. You can't judge by looking as easily. But I wondered how much of that was authentic to the neighborhood, that this is the way the people live there all the time, or if people just showed up for this event and everybody was friendly and smiling that day, but then, some people went back to their hedge funds and others went back to their slums, and so the question is how, is this just totally falling apart, or is this cohesive in some ways, or some kind of underlying logic of this kind of urbanization we're seeing now?
David, what do you think? You seem to really look at this kind of issue, and what do you think in contemporary times? Because you defined really excitingly to me the way in which the parks served a function of sort of basically of, for lack of a better term, disciplining the working class and making everybody sort of in the same image. What's happening today in these kind of big street fairs or big, public concerts?
Well, Marshall's point, I think, is well taken. The conversation for much of 80s and 90s probably was what's wrong with cities, and there is an increasing tendency to celebrate cities, but I tend to worry the way you do that the celebration is something that happens on the weekends, that the city, for many people, is a place you go, again, for leisure, for pleasure, for non-9-to-5 sort of daily occupations. And the question becomes, where do the people go when they're not in the cities? And then the other question is, who is actually, the pun this time is intended, occupying our cities 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? I'm not entirely pessimistic, but I do tend to think, Brooklyn, again, is an instructive model. People live in Brooklyn presumably because they can't afford to live in Manhattan. Not anymore. And the question now would be, though, who can afford to live in Brooklyn? As eventually will be. And so where are these people going? I'm...
So are we not? So it's one of the predicaments that we're in is with this dichotomy seemingly between the city as festival, as spectacle, and the reality of the increasing inequality of wealth. Are we not actually seeing, because of this isolation, how actually people are living, how what they're forced to do in order to survive? Both in the favelas and the impoverished areas of Nairobi or Rio de Janeiro, or
it's precisely what we don't see. The spectacle of the city is increasingly becoming a consumer spectacle. The people of the favelas and the Gece Kondus in Turkey, they're ex-urban in a sense. They're living on the margins of what were once sort of the outer rings of major metropolitan centers, and it's even hard to classify them as being urban if we're going to define urban as inner city or central city.
There's a lot to celebrate. The first question is, of course, who's celebrating the city, right? And what was it? 3-4 months ago, 5 months ago, there was this whole editorial on Vanity Fair. Given to Mrs. Ambani, which is the wife of Mr. Ambani, the richest guy in India. And there was this whole, I think, 4-spread. It was a huge editorial in Vanity Fair, an interview to her about her new house. And then the house was considered the most expensive house ever. $1 billion, right? With a permanent staff of 600 people, right? And also not long ago, there was the celebration of the most expensive sale or the most expensive apartment in New York in this building designed by this Pritzker Prize winner, Christian de Potsenbach, close to Carnegie Hall, penthouse, 2,000 square feet, $90 million, right? There's a lot to celebrate. Right? No, seriously. I would celebrate the city if I would be in that position. The possibility, of actually changing, the value of land, and speculate without limit, without limit. New York, in this case, becoming the depositor of all the wealth in the world, together with, Dubai and London, but New York especially. This building is being called the Billionaires Club. Right now, there are, I think, 11 billionaires out of the 1,100 that I was mentioning that already bought apartment there. It's never been seen before. And so, we fall prey to that celebration. And one of the praise, and I did not finish the argument I was going to make before, which was in relationship to residential and housing and displacement and sort of things. One of the biggest mistakes we also commit is that we look at housing as housing. I mean, we look at we tend to fragment our conception of the city immediately, because this is how the cities are fragmented. You have the Department of Transportation, you have the Department of Housing, you have these and these other things, not discussing with each other. And one of the big issues that happen in the Netherlands is, in my opinion, a big failure now of this trying to integrate with rent control or whatever, sort of these schematics. I was living in such a condition, is that there is not a single proposal of empowerment that goes beyond sort of the property itself, because the property will continue to gather, sort of to be speculated on, especially in these northern European states. There has to be a seriously radical change to rethink the city, not in terms of the space itself, but in the processes. I mean, in the politics, the policy you were mentioning, these sort of things, to radicalize these things, the economics of empowerment, which in a way they're the ones that construct those spaces. I mean, the public space should be everywhere. We should be able to take, the public space, not, one plaza. It should be.
So what do we celebrate now? What do we see?
I'm not celebrating anything. I'm celebrating that there are possibilities.
There are
moments. There are moments of insurrection that we are all living. The issue is that I'm not sure we're taking it so seriously as we should.
Tell us.
Again, example of Brooklyn. A model of an aggregation called Fury, which is composed by black women. It's a black woman. It's one of the most interesting non-profit organizations, radical organizations in Brooklyn, which have basically taken up in arms against Bruce Radner and the Atlantic Yards Project. And they've managed to actually stop and demand, affordability, but affordability composed together with options of employment, but not employment in the typical sense where you are exploited. I mean, like you have cooperative employment, where the worker becomes the owner of its means of production. Now, it's not just a matter of creating jobs, but it was, about it. Also with big policy chunks of control, participatory budgeting, for example, which is something that has been very fashionable in South America, but hardly has been discussed in these cases. The possibility of creating land trust. I mean, the U.S. has a fantastic capacity legally of creating community land trust. Why is it not explored enough? I don't understand. Limited equity co-ops, as I mentioned, which these are the situations where recompose or transform actually how cities are made, rather than just thinking about the unit of the housing or if I'm going to mix these people with that person. So these are the things that I'm.
So the issue really then is that. Sorry, David, go ahead. The issue really is one of from your point of view, is the issue of democratization, of the democratization and diversity of options available.
The access to power and the access to the budget that implies the construction of your own environment. These are the things that we should be demanding from the other side, which is not the one celebrating the $90 million apartment in New York.
At the other side, of course, we've seen things and we talked about it, and we don't still know how Kennedy Plaza is going to play out, because that area is undergoing quite a revision. And it's going to be very interesting to see who's allowed in there and what kind of facilities they're going to develop and who's going to gain access to it in various ways and what's going to attract people. The other thing about democracy is the ability to protest, it seems. And lately in protests in New York City, as well as other places, first of all, surveillance is much increased, but also they have protest pens. So basically the entire city is not available to protest, but limited spaces in which you are basically contained in a theme park of protest. So, essentially what we're really talking about is the difference between the democratization, the fact that people actually can have some control over their creative space. In much ways, they'd say, for instance, the people in the Lower East Side of New York did, the squatters, when they recognized this is property that's not being used, we're going to live there. Or when they took over and created the community gardens where Latino met anarchism, where all of a sudden the space became something that you could actually create as a creative person within the society. David.
I read recently that there was officially one squatter settlement remaining in Manhattan, and so I don't know if that's caused.
No,
Is there? Okay, I guess unofficially.
He can't tell you though exactly where.
I want to sort of flip it back and ask you a question and harken back to this.
I'm not supposed to be asked question, you know.
Okay, well, let's harken back to the 6-story apartment building in Queens.
Yeah.
With the mixed class residents of that building. One question would be, was that a matter of choice or a matter of necessity? And another question would be, would that be desirable today, and by whom? Does anyone want that today?
The diversity of...
Other than the people on the so-called bottom rungs of the socioeconomic ladder.
Yeah.
Is there a critical mass of enough middle classes and above who can see that's kind of organic urban community as being desirable to make it actually happen?
Well, it's very interesting, you know, whether it was. I mean, it was post-World War II. The buildings were built. Everybody was looking for a place at that point out of Brooklyn. And it was right near the subway, and there was gardens around it. And it was I think in some ways, it was also, the rent control movement has to be looked at, because it was a recognition that the tax breaks that were given to ownership had to be somehow transferred back to those who were actually paying the mortgage. And it was a sense that you didn't get rich by yourself, but you got rich by virtue of the largesse of the tax system. And so these structures were created for rent control for people kind of beginning their careers, or even as they got older, knowing and having the security and sense of community that comes from that security, that you weren't going to be priced out of existence. Yeah.
I mean, there's if I'm taking too much, please, interrupt. There's something that my European friends get totally amazed when I tell them that there is more housing subsidy in New York than there is in the Netherlands. It's like, you're crazy. I mean, because normally we think that the Dutch they have big houses. They used to. Right now they're just going away. Mm-hmm. But I was amazed when I discovered the amount of subsidized housing, at least in New York, which is the place where I've been living now. And in the case of rent control or any other format where you're supposed to pay 30% of your your salary into it. Now the question is, what happens to the other 70% of the rent? And the issue is that the government absorbs it. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know how, more than me, I guess, how this thing works. I mean, rent control and all these other policies have been put in place actually to continue to enrich the landlord. I mean, the government basically guarantees that the landlord will get paid, right? And they will get paid at market prices. So I've been working in the Bronx and basically in the Bronx, and you have all these rent control spaces where the landlord doesn't give a damn about the space, because they continue to be paid by the government for $3,000 apartment, right? And where the other person only gets paid $800, the person pays $800. For whatever reason, the subsidy, it's always on the landlord. I mean, the subsidies are there. I mean, this is something I've never really understood about how the management of the subsidy is not. And this allows actually for all these places to be the most coveted spaces. Nobody has access. Me as a newcomer in Manhattan, come on. I mean, like, really getting a rent control apartment, please.
No, it does. But I think that's to the point, though. And I think that's about who controls the city. Because in a way, there was huge political protests throughout my childhood when there was any kind of attempt to take the subsidy away from rent control. And it's less and less and less and less. that what happens is that the political power of those within those rent control spaces, and I don't know if people want to live in diverse environments anymore, whether they do or not. It's hard to say. But the political ability of people to control the way in which and the place in which they live has become less and less so. People don't have that much control of how they actually... Look what happened in Toledo, as you were saying. What happened when the mayor made minor changes?
Yeah, I mean, what we find is that I won't say it's decreased, but political participation in American, particularly municipal politics, has definitely changed. And most would argue, at least anecdotally, it has waned. Where when a new generation has come in, the idea of participating in your urban community's political scene has changed significantly. I mean, all you have to do is go to a city council meeting to see who's there, if anyone, including the councilors. Very few people are engaging in the really the business of the city. What we are finding, though, is that one reason why that's the case, what we find in polling data at least, is that in social capital polling data, is that one reason why people are feeling that way perhaps is because they have been locked out or shut out of the system for so long, they just given up and they don't participate. But when you elect the first Latino mayor of Providence, when you elect the first black mayor of Newton, Massachusetts, when you elect the first female mayor of Dayton, Ohio, then suddenly you see those groups that were never represented before at the table, because it's not that they don't understand that you can't create change at the table, it's that they no longer, if they don't feel as though they will have the opportunity to be heard at that table, then they're not going to go.
This is actually back to housing issues. And it strikes me that one huge problem in the United States, but I realize it's also elsewhere, I guess, is the desire to privately own one's own residence. And the city I know best outside of the U.S. is Dublin, and Dublin has been destroyed by that desire. During the boom, what happened was that people moved out of smaller rental spaces in the city into these huge new estates that, you know, I got 120% mortgages. That was not uncommon. And, of course, then came the crash. And those estates, you can drive for an hour through what used to be countryside, and it's just littered by these big new McMansion, what they call estates there, you know, hundreds of them looking somewhat alike, that are virtually uninhabited. And that's where squatters are moving now. It's awful and sad, and it's kind of depopulated the city center, and then, you know, equally depopulated what I guess are suburban rings. And it really is all about, for me anyway, this rage to own one's own space.
What happened to the urban places where they moved from?
Well, interestingly enough, some of them, some people were actually displaced by rising property values in the city center. So, for example, two of my cousins live in a 300-year-old working class house, a 2 up, 2 down, which is classic Dublin, that when they bought it in like 1968 was something like £2,000, I think, and that the one across the street sold for almost €1 million at the height of the boom. Literally a 4-room place. And that was a working class neighborhood. Well, it's not a working class neighborhood anymore. Which it's an empty neighborhood in some ways. It's really awful.
Which is the same thing happens often, at least in New York where I grew up, I'm sure in Rhode Island as well. The small shops can no longer keep up with the kind of rent that they need to pay.
Well, and in the U.S., this is not an accident. One of the top 5 interest groups in the United States, can anyone guess?
Yeah, Housing Owners Association.
Yeah, the National Association of Realtors.
No, Realtors.
National Association of Realtors. Yes, NRA. There's a few others, but they're always way up there, the top 2 or 3, and based on their level of activity and level of lobbying. of our here in the U.S. of our congressmen and women. That's not an accident, and we were talking about this earlier. I think there's an attachment to home ownership with the idea of the American dream. Every time you hear a politician, no matter the party, talking about the American dream, living in a single-family dwelling is some part of that discussion, even if it's indirect. And but we are finding, though, is that home ownership is in fact decreasing, in part because of foreclosures as a result of this recession in the last 5+ years or so. But also because we have a decreasing family size in the U.S. And so the need for 3,000 square feet, 2,000 square feet is decreasing when it might just be you and a significant other and a cat. You don't need all that space anymore. But that also is related to how we live in urban communities and how that has changed as well, where there is an increase in people wanting to live in so-called walkable communities. They want to be in close proximity with other people. Now, you're right, we don't quite know what type of people they want to be with, but there is the idea that they want to be in close proximity with people, shops, and that is in tune with the American environmental movement as well, where you can bike to work, you can walk to work, etc. And people want to be in those spaces. They call them fun, they call them energetic, and they also decrease your dependency on oil.
Yeah.
The issue of home ownership, it's all ending up in the issue of mortgages, finance, capital. I'm sorry to put all these examples, but I think Europe in 30 years changed so much that it's always very relevant to put it. The U.S. took longer, right? I mean, it was just it's been there for it's just capitalism has been sort of its blood for almost ever. In the case of the Netherlands, for example, before 1991, there was high incidence 80% of rental property. Switzerland still, several areas of Switzerland, especially the north, the German side, still has close to 80% of people living in whatever they call rent. They don't own a house, and they don't feel the need of owning anything, right? Because the government guarantees that there's some rights inscribed into the sort of rental, which doesn't, mean to. In the Netherlands and in many countries in Europe, France also went radically into it. Germany, also. They started when they started to enter into the neoliberal agenda, which was pretty much the privatization of everything. But one thing that gets not discussed in the neoliberal agenda is the financialization of things. The government started a very aggressive campaign of urging people to buy, incredibly aggressive. One of the biggest things they changed was the taxation system when they started to offer tax credits.
Let me just cut you short for a bit here. What does that mean in terms of how people actually live, in terms of what neighborhood look like, in terms of how they actually live day to day?
In principle, in the first it was a bonanza, because it was literally a bonanza. But this happened also in Eastern Europe when property was given.
So the property values went up.
Not only did they went up, but suddenly people were sitting in 200,000 euros. I mean, out of nowhere. Right.
Right. So they had money to put into the system.
Total, false capital, that was put into there. But the idea that you could own, was held by this tax deduction.
Right.
And they removed every single tax held deduction to rental. So it didn't make sense to rent anymore. Right.
No, it's. I understand this. I understand the economic, the governmental subsidy of it.
Yes.
The question I'm asking is how the rubber again hits the road. Whose city is it? How do people?
In principle, everybody. There was a bonanza, right?
Yeah.
Everybody got to sit in their own house.
Right.
And this lasted 15 years until the current crisis, where there's huge vacancies. People are moving back to their parents. Because the property was so overinflated that they got mortgages. Similar that what happened here, right? In a way, for them it was a new experience, right?
So basically, what you see is the gutting of different parts of the city because of that
completely.
dependency.
And the migrant classes, those that the unempowered, the disenfranchised, etc., could no longer rent because the rents were put on the market value. So before you could rent an apartment for 400 and 600 euros, which is quite low in that, and right now you'd be hard pressed to find one for less than 1,000. Those are disappearing. I mean, the 600 is sort of a control system because everything shifted to the market condition. They have huge problems, and that is all over Europe.
So the real issue, I mean, we're going to probably close it up in about 5 minutes. The real issue really is how various people live in the cities and how can that be shifted, changed, altered as we move along. That's really where we're at this point. It seems like, just to sum up, that there's a great deal of gentrification, celebration of the inner city as an arcade and as a center for entertainment and possible diversity of experiences and people. Possible. And at the same time, there's large swaths in Providence where we don't even know what's going on. We don't know how many people are living in how many houses, in one apartment. We don't know how many people are suffering day to day because they can't pay the rent. We don't know how many people are moving from place to place. And we don't actually realize and know about the services that are available for large swaths of our population. So in a way, we're living in sort of a tale of two cities once again, as I sort of imagining it. On one side, we have a side of the society which either aspires to or has the money to afford the cafes and the accoutrements of modern urban life. On the other side, we have huge amounts of people, much more people, whose lives remain invisible. That's what seems to be the case that we're presented. Am I oversimplifying this?
I don't think so. I mean, I would just be very brief. As an urbanist, all my degrees are in political science, 2 of which are right from down the street at Brown. I would argue that one reason why we don't know that data of who is underemployed, who is struggling to pay rent, etc. That is what we might call social capital or social political data. And the reason is because we do not have scholars who are doing that polling data in municipal communities. It's been one of my complaints as being someone who studies predominantly medium-sized U.S. cities between 100 and 500,000 in population, where we don't know a lot of information. And simply put, if we all had $30,000 to give, that's the average cost of a poll. That has a general sample and that can be tested and given some modes of validity that we would all therefore then trust. But we don't have those resources to go out and ask the Providence Plan or ask professors at Brown or here at URI Providence or at Providence College to go find money and resources for a $30,000 survey to ask that question. In some cases we do, but in most cases they're all in the major cities. We know we can find that information about New Yorkers. We can find that information about Chicagoans or about people from Los Angeles, Miami. Big cities, we have that data. We don't have it in the medium-sized cities.
The question would be, though, if you can actually afford to live in a city today, are you one of the people who would want that information? Is there not just the capital available? Is there the political will available?
And this comes from this separation, and sometimes the willful sense of denial that exists about the population of the 1% or the 99%. Okay. Yeah, Marshall.
Yeah, I just want to. I think to me the issue is really the politics of it all, not the policies even. I mean, let me just throw out two very mild policies, relatively mild policies that can't even be talked about in the U.S. today. One is a friend of mine is doing a thing in Berkeley on the lasting New Deal, and they're trying to inventory all the things from the New Deal, like the WPA, that still survive today. And I was just walking by Stevenson Stadium at Brown on Saturday, and there on the sidewalk is a plaque from WPA. So, you know, these add a tremendous amount to the urban fabric and the fabric of life in this country, and it's sort of demonized now that all those New Deal programs, including rent control and things, which also came out of that. The other thing, as an example, is capital gains, which here as a policy we make no distinction between capital gains that actually invests in something new that creates something versus pure transfers of ownership. And so pure asset investment, which leads to all the inflation and so on. We make no distinction at all. If you could bring up those two issues in policy debates, which, if you look at the presidential debates, it's almost impossible to bring up something like that, right? So the point is, it's not so much the policies aren't there. There's a political atmosphere. I'm thinking, the title of this session about urbanization reminded me of the famous essay, Urbanization as a Way of Life. And it seems to me in the 21st century, as a way of life, has become one of being divorced from looking at big issues. I mean, the Occupy movement was, I think, almost an anomaly over the last 20, 30 years as an urban social movement. So the question is, what about the politics today, and how might there be a breakthrough to actually put on the table some of these kinds of issues?
One thing that comes into my attention is, yes, the importance of city and city mayors in the sort of the smaller sort of pieces. I've been working very closely with an urbanist named Alejandro Echeverri from Medellin, which has actually orchestrated incredible changes in the most sort of detrimental areas of the city. At the same time that you had Álvaro Uribe, the most sort of right-wing, sort of pro-market president Colombia has had in a few years, a few decades. But inciting very interesting policy, of not only reframing how wealth is redistributed, redistributing wealth, but also in terms of tracing the lines of how cities would be built. I think that the national sense and national politics, you will never going to see these type of things. We need these sort of radical mayors that really take do what they need to do what they have to do, let's say. I'm not saying it's easy or simple, right? There were many programs that the U.S. has experimented with. I mean, not talking about international programs, but the U.S. alone. For example, Reagan introduced this homesteading program, right? Which was so successful they had to cancel it, right? Because it was not doing what it had to do, which was, aid privatization. It was actually aiding those that could not have access to housing. Issues, again, different property measures. That we're right now working. I co-direct also a nonprofit organization based in the Netherlands, but we're working right now with a small government in Canada, close to Toronto, to reinstate co-housing, sort of a structure of co-housing with land trust structure and the most derelict neighborhoods there. So reframing those sort of things, subsidized housing, into much more empowerment sort of things. And this is a major that is doing this. And it has gotten the attention of also people from Toronto, from this and the other. And I've been invited already to talk about it a few times. And these are very small changes. A friend of mine is starting also to produce a very productive property scheme together with the mayor of Liverpool in London, which even the people from the London School of Economics have even just like, what are you doing? I mean, this is impossible that we can do. It just requires, first, knowledge that there are things there. And one of the things that our universities have done to us is that they've taken away the most important knowledge. They have come to us as made us very passive, let's say, with the most traditional knowledge, understanding that we can only own or we can only rent, where there are so many schematics that need to be explored, that are there, that are not utopic, that exist and existed. And so that idea of fusing knowledge with a powerful sort of, radical politics in terms of re-earthing, rerouting the things, it just requires an interesting mayor and a few people around them that are willing actually to take that leap. I mean, this might be that here, with this new urban studies program, is the beginning of something, or new associations with Brown, or with whomever it's around. But certainly, the role of the academic has to be on pressuring real transformation. It's here where those ideas are still sort of alive. I've been in several universities already in the U.S. where they don't know what co-housing is, and some do and some not. But what's going on with us also, as not being active enough to actually stay into those level of politics. No? In the case of a city like New York, where you have Bloomberg, there's nothing you can do with Bloomberg, right? But there is the person in charge of East New York, for example, no? That is very interested in solving the housing question, which always implies many things, that is now becoming open to, studying a special program on issues of land trust, of such and such. So I think there are possibilities, because American people, and I'm going to sound very nationalistic here, because right now we're in the US, American people have showed in certain instances in history that these things are possible, right? And have been possible. And so there is something that I see coming, no? That I think we have to jump in the bandwagon, or because that idea of being the avant-garde is kind of ridiculous. We have so much history on our backs, that we have to just take it seriously, and forget all these sort of crappy things that don't work, which is normally what we're putting the urban studies, right? I mean, knowing and revising right now these things.
Real quick, in order for that to work, Miguel, yes. You have to have politicians who are willing to lose. I mean, that's the practical implication of what you're saying. Yes. So either we as citizens are going to wait until they do essentially very little in their first term, and then they get reelected based on doing very little and dealing with the American political system, and then hopefully hope that they're going to be completely different in their second term.
You're talking about a certain person running in...
I'm not going to comment on that. Or you're going to have to be willing to find a politician like some of the ones in my book that is coming out in April, where they said that they do not see themselves as politicians, but rather as social workers. Yes. But all of them lost re-election.
Yeah, and then you got the example, for example, of Newark. Cory Booker, a very close friend of mine, is the head of urban planning there. And very interesting guy. I mean, he has been trying they're on the waterfront development plan, and he has been trying like hell for already, 5-6 years to put affordable housing in the... It hasn't been, it's just not. And so even also the masking of this sort of politics that I think citizens, what I love about Brooklyn's urban movements and Queens urban movements that I've been studying recently is that these people don't wait for the politicians, right? They're just there. I mean, they're just, like in the picketing, like really seriously pushing it. And some academics have started to work with them.
Well, with that bit of optimism, I think it's a good way to end and go watch the debates if we actually want to do that. Ravi Perry, thank you.
Thank you.
And good luck in your move down to Mississippi.
Thank you.
David Faflik, thank you. Miguel Robles, thank you. Kat, Marsh, thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you in a couple weeks when we're actually going to talk about work and where